So the recording will start now. So hello everyone and welcome to our symposium, The Future by the Sea. My colleague Victoria and I are very excited to have you all here. This symposium has been an idea born through the similarities in the work that Victoria and I have been doing, which we discovered during the ECOWAS 7 conference in Helsinki in 2022. As we will discuss today, a lot of us have discovered that maritime archaeological research relates directly to the future and has a significant role to play during the climate emergency that we are all experiencing. Maritime archaeological assets, coastal and underwater, are and will be impacted severely by climate change effects, including sea level rise, flooding, and coastal erosion. In the same time, maritime archaeology is a unique resource with which we can learn how people lived with watery environments in the past, but also how they live with them in the present, and therefore suggest solutions and the best ways of adaptation and building resilience. Despite this importance of archaeology in general and maritime archaeology in particular in dealing with the challenges of climate change that we see in the present and we will see in the future, frequently there is not enough funding or time to pursue such research inquiries. So most projects on maritime archaeology and climate change usually come either from the passion and personal interest of the researchers or the need that arises, for example, if maritime heritage remains get impacted by climate change effects and then interventions are needed. So in this symposium, we hope that we bring together basically all of us who have been examining various maritime archaeological and maritime heritage topics that relate to the environment and climate change. We are really looking forward to hearing everyone's work and everyone's perspectives, and we want to discuss all together how to best proceed in this new situation that we are experiencing, not just as scholars and scholars of heritage and archaeology, but also as individuals of the generation of climate change. Now I'll give the word to Victoria for a couple of remarks from her too.
So welcome everybody, and thank you for being here. It's an honor for me to have this conference, this symposium with you. And today we're going to count with the participation of very young researchers who are going to meet just to share ideas about climate change, about how archaeology can contribute to this topic. And so the idea is that this symposium could work as a network, so we can all together create an environment of learning and collaboration. I think this is a unique opportunity that we have a lot of different conferences from different parts of the world. And so it can help us understand how is archaeology being done in this all over the world. So I think culture is very powerful and it's a source of identity and resilience. So through this, we can actually have our little apport to the climate change impacts and to see how we can do as a society. And so how can we apport also to the Sustainable Development Goals? Thank you very much for your presence, really.
Perfect. Thank you, Victoria. So just before we start, I would like to point out a couple of practical details for the course of the symposium and the course of the day. So all participants, please make sure you have your microphones turned off during the presentations. Each presentation is going to be 15 minutes. So at the end of its talk, we will have 5 minutes available for questions, during which you can turn on your microphones and ask directly to the speakers any questions or any comments that you have. But also we will be monitoring the chat, so feel free to pop in there any questions or comments, or if you have any issues with the connection or the sound, please just inform us in the chat. Also, we have some changes in the program that you might have seen, and you might have received an email about it as well. We have a change in session 1 and some small time changes in session 4 because the speaker could not attend today. But this would not overall affect the day. It will just give us a little bit more time for discussion at the very end. So in terms of the discussion, at the very end, we have a whole session planned for discussing basically various issues with that have to do with maritime archaeology and climate change, and in that all participants, not just the presenters but also the audience, are very welcome to participate. Other than that, if you have any other questions or comments, you can ask us now. or if not, we could even start a little bit early with our presentations. So, Victoria, I think you will be chairing session 1, right? So I'll just hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. And so the first session is called Archaeological and Environment Entanglements. What we want to this session is to realize how we humans adapt to the climate in different scales of time. And so our first conference is Below the Lagoon Waters, Archaeological Markers to Evaluate Environmental Changes, from Elisa Costa and Carlotta Lucarini, who are coming from the University of Venice and the University of Murcia. So I give the word to our conferences now.
Hello, thank you. So we will share the screen. Okay. Can you see and can you hear us? Okay.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, so good morning to everyone. I am Carlotta Lucarini and she's Elisa Costa, and we would like first to thank all the organization for giving us the possibility to be here today and to open the symposium. That is a very important work. In this contribute, we will present a study about archaeological markers to evaluate environmental changes below the lagoon waters. As all of us know, coastal stretches are rich in archaeological evidences that testifies to the long-lasting interaction of ancient communities with the aquatic environment. But all these contexts are nowadays greatly influenced by ongoing climate and environmental changes, such as the rising sea level and some linked geological phenomena. Sea level change is the sum of eostatic and glacial hydro and isostatic and tectonic factors. The first is global and time dependent, while the other two vary according to location. So in order to study and understand this variation, archaeological evidences in microtidal areas, such as the shoreline of the Mediterranean Sea, can provide significant information. Especially ancient coastal structures can be crucial. In the Mediterranean, the amount of subsidence rate is not straightforward, since large uncertainties exist both in terms of age and position of the paleo shorelines of sample deposits. Given all these uncertainties for Adriatic area, the subsidence can be estimated at a rate of around 1 millimeters per year. For this reason, the analysis of submerged and semi-submerged archaeological context in lagoon waters can testify not only the impact of anthropic modification to the landscape in ancient and modern time, but it also permits the establishment of significant archaeological markers of ongoing environmental changes. Among others, there are maritime villas, piers, fish tank buildings, and buildings foundation. In this kind of studies, the research method starts from the archaeological analysis of the context, studying the typology and the function of the structures, and their construction technique, which are valuable indicators of elevation or depth at the time of construction. Obviously, the dating of the installation and the phase of abandonment or defunctionalization are critical. All this data has been to be related to the local tidal excursion and to the eustatic and subsidence phenomena. At the same time, cartographic comparisons are key elements for the comprehension of environmental changes suffered by coastlines and for the reconstruction of the ancient landscape. But what happens in those amphibious environments where water is not always water and land is not always dry? What happens in a lagoon environment? A lagoon is defined as a coastal basin of brackish water bordered by a coastal strip, and it's connected to the sea by openings through which water exchange occurs. The degree of salinity is variable and depends on multiple factors. The depth is mainly very low and different zones can be distinguished. Due to the overall fleshy bottom, the visibility is generally very low. The Venice lagoon in particular is characterized by a scarcely depressed basin with an average water depth of about 1 meter. It communicates with the sea through 3 large canals, which cause an average tidal excursion of about 70 centimeters every 6 hours. The hydrodynamic trend of the lagoon water is closely linked to the tide and is strongly influenced by the configuration of the channels. Conducting underwater survey and excavation in such a peculiar situation is not always easy, and there are some pros and cons. The overall warm weather from spring to autumn is not a constant, and the general shallowness permits safe and log diving. The shallow depth doesn't constitute an obstacle for the use of water dredge, and at the same time, it facilitates the realization of manual core drillings. In contrast to offshore sites, the proximity to land greatly simplifies certain stages of the field and allows the use of critical instrumentation. Another no less important element is the state of preservation of the organic materials, which, when sealed by lagoon sediments in a complete anoxic environment, are perfectly preserved. On the other hand, difficulties are numerous and not to be underestimated. The particular type of silty clay sediment is the main responsible for poor visibility, and it affects immensely the agility of the excavation itself and, above all, the documentation of the site. Tidal fluctuation affects currents, which can be so strong that no activity is possible, but also the operative time and, of course, the visibility. So this is why careful planning of operation is a must, and depending on the activity, it's necessary to choose a specific moment of the day looking at the tide calendar. The archaeological investigation below the waters of Venice Lagoon began in the 60s, primarily by amateurs. The methods used were obviously different from those ones that we put in practice today. Through the use of a metal probe from the surface, it was possible to recognize the consistency and the type of bottom and materials, such as bricks, stone, or wood, which sound differently. They used to carry out sediment sampling with manual core drillings and to recover materials to characterize and date the site more precisely. Although this kind of investigation were very important to map the presence of archaeological remains in the lagoon, their limits are evident in comparison with the modern research methods.
From 2020, the team of Maritime Archaeology of Ca' Foscari University, coordinated by Professor Carlo Beltrame, is working on in the northern part of the Venice Lagoon, focusing on these Roman submerged sites, basically in the main big channel in the northern lagoon from the sea, and the sites are San Felice, Cavallarina, and Le Piccolo, and now we are working with ongoing project in Scanello and the harbor of Alpino. An important part of the project is carried out in collaboration with geomorphologists from the University of Padua, Paolo Mozzi, to deeply analyze and reconstruct the paleo environment of the lagoon and the relative sea level changes, in particular for the Roman times. Geophysical instruments, such as the multi-beam echo sounder, are essential to the survey, in particular for survey wide areas, in order to detect underwater sites and also to document the bottom and realize accurate bathymetric maps that are important both for archaeological studies and for environmental studies. In order, for the archaeological point of view, in order to acquire scaled and referenced data, one of the first operations is the topographic survey of the site. Since the 90s, underwater, the DSM technique, the direct survey method, is one of the best procedures to obtain 3D coordinates of the targets. This is a simple trilateration, but with a direct measurement in 3D, and it can be used simply with metric rules and computer diving for measured depth. In lagoonal context, thanks to the shallow water and the proximity to the shore, it is possible also to employ the total station. To reach the bottom and leave the prism sufficiently above the water level, we have to build a long pole around 4 meters with a large weight on its base and a floating polystyrene on the top to ensure the perfect vertical position. Almost perfect, but we have to check every time we're at spirit level the correct vertical position. The photogrammetric survey is essential and is generally realized at the end of the rising tide, when the sediment suspension are minimal, and also during the inversion of the tide, when the strength of the kernel begins to reduce. The most suitable outline is represented by the union of nadiral strips orthogonal to the subject and by radial strips, maintaining every time the correct overlap between the strips. From the photogrammetric model, it is possible also to create a digital elevation model with different colors depending on the depth of the structures. The combination of these procedures is fundamental for the analysis of the archaeological markers. In this slide, we can see the digital models of the so-called Torrione San Felice, which has been reinterpreted as a well cistern. In fact, it lies at around 3 meters of depth, and it must have been built directly underwater, also in Roman times. The same kind of documentation with the photogrammetry has been realized on the broken Roman pier in Caballarin, and here we can see the 3D model with the text, with the original text from the pictures, and here you can see the digital elevation model. In this context, the green and blue blocks collapsed on the bottom of the channel, reaching almost 6 meters of depth. On the contrary, it is evident that the portion of the pier in red color is still in the original position, and it is confirmed by the presence of the foundation poles. This latter block lies at 170 centimeters, and it represents an important mark to calculate the rising of the sea level from Roman times. In fact, this depth confirms the range resulting from the geomorphological analysis. The last case study that we present today, which is still an ongoing project, is the so-called Roman villa of L.Victoria. Also in this context, the digital models prove to be essential, not only for the documentation of the site in a very detailed and accurate way, but also for the analysis of the sea level change. The sites present 2 different archaeological markers: the basin with a layer of oysters in the bottom, a vivarium, that originally were realized underwater and is represented here in the blue color, and it's around 3 meters of depth. And around 50 foundation poles, probably of a foundation wall or a building that is represented in orange and red color. And this original has to be on land and to be built in dry condition. And here we are around 1 meter and 35 centimeters. Considering the impossibility of creating underwater museum trails or snorkeling tours in such a difficult situation, unlike in other underwater contexts around the Adriatic and the Mediterranean Sea, the 3D models with interactive maps, wedges, virtual reality, and so on, enable everyone to see what our eyes or even a diver's eyes cannot see, providing a global view of the archaeological deposits. Thanks to these technologies, it is therefore possible to return to the community a part of its heritage, which was until recently forgotten under the turbid lagoon waters. As is now well established, the use of GIS software in the archaeological field has become indispensable. In our case, even more, because it allows not only for the management of the wall data for easier and more immediate consultation and visualization, but also for the effective dissemination and divulgation of the research results. Expanding our view and studies outside of Venice, the comparisons between other lagoonal landscape and wet environments along the western part of the Mediterranean is an additional important factor to deeply analyze the anthropic settlements in Roman times. And here we are some lagoon from the southeast Iberian coastline and the Gulf of Lyon in the south of France. In some of these contexts, especially in the lagoonal areas of the southern part of France, great similarities have been observed in the employment of some building techniques in underwater and also humid environment. This testifies similar management of the lagoon spaces in ancient times and common responses to similar environmental issues. A deep analysis of these factors permits to understand if the lagoonal space has been submitted to common evolutive dynamics, and otherwise, if the difference development can be related to specific factors, naturals or anthropic. As you can see from the first three pictures, there are some archaeological sites in red, orange, and yellow color that are now on land that were originally on the shoreline of the big lagoon that you can see in the first picture. And or there are some ancient lagoon, the same on the right, that now are completely filled by sediments. To conclude, this experience confirms how digital techniques have brought to the documentation to a new approach and a new life for the archaeological documentation. This methodology, despite the difficulties of the lagoon environment, offers the precious opportunity to produce an entire overview of the underwater archaeological sites, which implies enormous advantages for this understanding and appreciation, in particular in a lagoon context where a site is never completely visible. 3D survey technique has become an essential tool for archaeology in order to study the underwater archaeological markers below the lagoon water. In fact, those are precious evidences which permit to understand not only the past evolutive dynamic, but also to predict the future ones. Numerous studies and field surveys have shown that the Venice lagoon is undergoing erosion with a loss of fine sediments. And obviously, artificial activities such as channel dredging and filling greatly affect not only the natural environment, but also the state of conservation of the archaeological sites, so that some of them are really in danger of disappearing forever. And thanks for your attention.
Okay, so thank you to you also for keeping up on time. It's very good people keep on time. And well, I don't know if there is any question in the chat. Someone wants to do it by microphone or something. We have 5 minutes for questions, so feel free, please, to ask any question. Okay, nice. No one wants to start.
I have a question for
Yeah,
for you. Yeah, I was wondering, you have uncovered so many patterns and changes in sea level rise from this research from history, and I was wondering if you have looked a little bit at what's happening now to and into the future, and if you can spot, for example, like any like faster sea level rise or difference in what has happened in the past, because we know like that sea level rise, as you said, from archaeological remains, they are markers that this has happened, things have gone underwater, and we know all around the Mediterranean side, and of course in the Venice lagoon even more. So I was wondering if you can look at all like in the present, the future, and like use the deeper history data that you have to actually like create some more awareness to the people about what's basically coming and what could happen in that area of the Mediterranean.
I think this is a big question because the sea level changes in this period, it's a big problem. It's difficult to understand the velocity, the fastness of the evolution of the sea level. We have seen from also from other studies, not our studies, from geologists, that also in a very ancient time, in glacial time, the sea level is really changed a lot more than now. They made some analysis that, for example, if the northern part of the world, the glacial part of the world, can melt, we can reach an higher level of the sea around 7 meters. But it's really important. It's really difficult that this could happen in a few years. It's a big evolution, but it's important for example, in this map, you can see that in few times you can see the level in few times, but not few times, because we have 100 here. You can see that the level could rise around 3 meters in the red part, the red color part of the map. And for example, in this part of the northern Adriatic is not only the lagoon water, but also this part that now is complete land. It could be a very big problem. So for the archaeological point of view, we have to understand how to document this site in a very precise, very detailed and accurate way, because it's the only way to maintain the archaeological sites for the future, for the environment, for the cultural heritage. It's the only way to share the past, and maybe all of us will become archaeological. So it's it's another question for everybody, I think.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I also have a question, very, very small. Since you're using geophysical survey and photogrammetry, have you seen any difference maybe in the different years that you've been working on this? Or are you planning to do in the future a continuity of this project with this kind of tools?
Yes, we usually use these tools, the photogrammetry, the multi-beam, and the GIS, starting from the network, topographic network for the analysis of the depth, and to georeference the model and also the site. And now we have a project with Ca' Foscari University and Professor Beltrame inside the changes project with the PNRR, and we are working for the next 2 or 3 years inside the lagoon of Venice, obviously employing with this kind of instruments and techniques, because are absolutely important and essential for the analysis. And sometimes in the lagoon we have very, very murky waters. So it's difficult to use the photogrammetry and photography. So we are trying to use ancient analysis with the metal probe to understand the bottom, but it's not sufficiently. So every time we have to search the best moment of the day to use the photograph and photogrammetry, and but at the same time the multi-beam is very important, because now we have a project with a multi-beam that can work in very, very shallow water, also along the coast, the shoreline of the channel. And it's important because he can work also in the worst condition of the visibility.
Okay, thank you so much. So now it's 10 and 5, so we can give the word to the next conference, which is entitled Traditional Shipbuilding on the Island of Samos, Current State and Future Perspectives by Katerina Velentza. It's a pleasure for me to present you.
Thank you very much. So let me just share my screen. Here we go. I hope you can all see my screen now.
Yes.
Perfect. So this paper describes basically the results of a recent maritime ethnographic fieldwork that I did on the island of Samos in September 2022 as part of my project reimagining the use of traditional watercraft in the Aegean Sea for a sustainable environment economy that is held at the University of Helsinki between 2021 and 2024. So I'm going to start with explaining the methodology that I used for this study. I will talk a little bit about the island of Samos and why shipbuilding is an important thing to study there. And then I'm going to present the archaeological data that I recorded along with the intangible data that I recorded, and conclude with some small comments on the longevity of this traditional craft and what we could learn from this piece of local knowledge and how it could help for the future. So prior to my fieldwork on the island of Samos, I carried out a very detailed literature review about traditional shipbuilding in Greece and the Aegean in general, and I did also some more thorough reading about Samos and the various traditional crafts relating to the use but also building of traditional boats. Along with that, I also conducted an online research on historical archives in which I basically tried to find either historical documents or historic pictures related again to Samos and the use or creation of traditional boats. For the data collection during the fieldwork, I carried out a photographic survey, basically recording all of the material record observed in the 4 operating traditional shipyards that I visited in Samos, but I also conducted semi-structured interviews with the shipbuilders, which were conducted all in Greek, and they were recorded through note-taking and digital audio recording. So this methodology is following the principles of maritime ethnography, which is a core subdiscipline of maritime archaeology, and focuses basically on the study of contemporary maritime cultures and their materials through first-hand observation. And this subject area is linked very frequently with the need of rescuing and recording traditions, maritime ways of life, and watercraft that are rapidly changing or disappearing, which is something that Son McGrail, one of the earliest scholars to carry out maritime ethnographic research, has noted. And this is very relevant for the case of Samos and the Aegean, as I will explain in a second. Overall, though, the aims of my study was not just to document the tangible and intangible heritage relating to the creation and use of traditional boats, but I also wanted to assess the longevity of this craft for the future and demonstrate the significant links that traditional wooden boats and shipbuilding have with the local knowledge of the maritime communities, and how this can help basically to pursue sustainable and resilient ways of living in the region. The island of Samos has a very long tradition of shipbuilding, shipbuilding must have been conducted on the island for at least 2,000 years. The mountainous nature of the island and the availability of timber, as you can see in green on the map of at the left-hand side, made shipbuilding an easy activity to conduct, but also the key location of the island in various passages for sailing routes in the Eastern Mediterranean encouraged basically the development of shipbuilding over the centuries. Currently, we have 4 active traditional shipyards on the island of Samos. You can see them with the red dots, one in Karlovasi, one at Trakai, one at Agios Isidoros, and one at Pyrgos. From the literature review I did, but also from historical sources that I discovered during my research, there's also 4 more shipyards mentioned that they were operating in the 20th century at Kokari, at Varsamo, at Ormus Marthocampu, and at Pythagorio. And from the research that Kostas Damianidis did in the 1980s and 1990s, again, there are 2 shipyards mentioned at Samos, But as you can see here, marked in yellow, most shipyards from all around Greece, from a variety of places in Greece, are using timbers from Samos for shipbuilding, and that's because of the high content of resin that these pines, especially the pines from Samos, have, that has been mentioned in the research that Damianidis did several decades ago, but also in the research that I did right now. So if we look at the archaeological data that are recorded, despite the different locations of the shipyards, as you might have seen over here, two of them are on the seaside at Karlovas and Iusisidros, but the other two at Rakei and Pyrgos are built on higher terrain. Despite these different locations, the setting of the work and the working environment of the shipyards are very, very similar. All shipyards consist of an open air and a covered space where the various stages of the shipbuilding take place. The covered space is usually a roofed workshop or warehouse where most of the tools for processing timbers are set, along with a small space for office activities. And depending on the size of the covered workshop and the size of the ordered vessel, some shipbuilding activities can take place indoors as well. The shipyards are surrounded by material remains of shipbuilding that make the location identifiable, basically as a shipbuilding site. These tangible remains include pieces of timber, either processed or unprocessed, as well as wooden boats awaiting completion or repair. In some sites where older shipyards existed, but they are not longer in operation, we also can find abandoned tools like the bancho that you see here at the lot, an abandoned shipyard at Ormos Marthokabu. But also some communities also commemorate shipbuilding activities that used to happen in their area but are no longer taking place, with the murals and other basically ways of commemorating the locals who worked on these traditional crafts. So if we move on to the intangible data that are recorded, the 4 active shipyards of Samos are all small businesses owned right now by individual shipbuilders. The shipbuilders work mostly alone, but they frequently require the assistance of other fellow shipbuilders who do not own their shipyards, or by family members such as their spouses or children. And the most shipbuilders that I interviewed were trained at the shipyard of Iusisidros that you can see here on the left, which was a major shipbuilding site for Samos since the 1930s. And they all started their training at the ages between 8 and 15 years old. And the Cove of Iusisidros back then used to be a very vibrant place with multiple shipyards operating at the same time and dozens of people working on the site. So the Cove was basically a school for young men to learn the traditional shipbuilding craft. And up until the 1980s, shipbuilding took place there without electricity. But the work at Iusisidros started to decline in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and right now there's only one shipyard left there. The shipyards work all year round, and they construct multiple kayak every year depending on the number of the orders that they receive, but also the size. They construct fishing and leisure boats of all traditional types depending on the needs of the customer. All boats they construct have inboard engines for propulsion, because that change from sails to diesel engines happened in the middle of the 20th century, but they frequently add sails in the design at the request of the customer. And the shipbuilders, as I said before, use local Samian pine, which allegedly has a very high content of resin, making the boats very durable for the weather conditions and the salt water of the Aegean specifically. The timbers that they use need to be healthy and they have the right dimensions for the boat order. So the shipbuilders go in the forest themselves, select and cut the timbers, of course with the accompanied by and with the assistance of the local forest management officials who approve the felling and the removal of the timbers from the forest. Earlier in the 20th century, there were specialized woodcutters who were commissioned for that task to supply timbers for the shipbuilding activities in each shipyard. But right now, the shipbuilders do the whole work themselves. And after the felling, of the trees, they are kept in the forest for a bit until they are released by the forest authorities, where some of the seasoning takes place, and then after that the seasoning takes place in the shipyards, and it depends on the use or the type of the boat that they were going to be making. For every boat project, the shipbuilders follow traditional methods for the design and the building process. All boats are frame-based, so the skeleton of the boat is constructed first, and then the planks are added later. After receiving an order, the shipbuilders discuss with the customer the type and the size of the boat, and this way the boat builder considers and determines the form and the hull based on its intended function and the methods of propulsion. But their method of design does not involve any detailed plans or models. On the contrary, the design and building of its vessel occurs through a traditional empirical process that involves a more abstract conception of a boat's form, which has been maintained and transferred through successive generations of boat builders. And in this boat design process, the method of molding, but also the method of lofting are used. And you can see here on the right-hand side, the lofting line plan known as Sala that Yorgos Petru has been using to calculate the dimensions of a boat that he was making at the shipyard of Pyrgos. During my research, I also tried to focus on the problems that the shipbuilders are having at present. So all of them mentioned that since the last 2 decades of the 20th century and more in the 21st century, the shipbuilding profession, the traditional shipbuilding profession, is in rapid decline due to the various problems they're facing. And all shipbuilders interviewed expressed their opinion that the modernization of the Aegean Islands and the provision of government resources only for the promotion of tourism has totally changed the local economies and has reduced the fleet of traditional wooden boats that they used to have in their local islands, and that basically has impacted their business and their craft, the survival of their craft. Also, they mentioned that basically the impact that traditional artisanal fishermen have with the competition of big trawlers and also the use of plastic and fiberglass boats has really affected their work. But one of the biggest issues that they also mentioned is the big wildfires that have been happening in Samos since the early 21st century, since the early 2000s. And this has been making basically what they called they have been making the trees sick, and because of this they cannot really use necessarily the forests around their shipyards for shipbuilding, and they have to basically go to other sides of the island that they hadn't been burned before to retrieve the required wood. Also, sorry. Oops, here we go. Another big problem is basically the destruction of traditional boats that has been happening since the late 90s by the government, by the Greek government, in a effort basically to enforce an EU legislation for the reduction of the fishing fleet of its European state. So the government is giving substantial amounts of money in return of a fisherman's fishing license, but also of their traditional boat that needs to be destroyed by a bulldozer. And this has been a very sensitive subject for all of the shipbuilders. And they have been feeling very, very emotional about the fact that their handmade works of art, as they call them, are destructed in this terrible way by the government itself. Overall, despite this sense of hopelessness expressed by all shipbuilders regarding the future, most of them think that their craft won't survive in the next 2 decades. When we started discussing about sustainability and environmentally friendly practices in the Aegean, they all thought that the traditional boats and their craft could have a very core role in this. All of them stated that a wooden kaiki has an excellent energy consumption because of how durable it is and how well it can float and navigate in the weather and sea conditions of the Aegean. And if sails are added like they used to be in the past, and using engines only as auxiliary methods of propulsion for bad weather and difficult navigation spots, the kaiki could be the low carbon solution that the Aegean needs right now. They also noted So yeah, they also noted that because of the core part of local knowledge that they carry with their craft, they could be part of the adaptation and the mitigation strategies that they could start having on islands like Samos. And also they mentioned that their craft could be open for basically adding modern technologies such as solar panels in the traditional designs to make the traditional craft even more adaptable to climate change and what's coming in the future. And of course, they all think that traditional kaikia could be reintroduced in the islands for transport of people and goods, which happened in the past but does not exist as a practice anymore, because this could help, for example, remote islands that, as you can see in this map here, like the islands of Lipsi, Patmos, and Anafi, are not reached sometimes for over 90 hours in a week by a mainline ferry. So they think by reintroducing these smaller boats, they could actually cover the needs of these remote islands that are experiencing quite a lot of marginalization because of the lack of more frequent and smaller connections among the islands. And just to conclude, as McElroy pointed out, the wooden ships and boats in the pre-industrial times were the most significant technological achievements for the Aegean communities. However, with the current state of the modernization of the Aegean communities, most parts of local knowledge and the maritime identities related to the use and building of traditional boats have disappeared, making the population to experience more continental ways of living and seeing the sea as a big obstacle that they need to live with. Given the close interrelation of ships and boats with their natural environment and the society that has been producing them, as John Adams has pointed out, I think that safeguarding or reintroducing traditional boats right now to these communities that are experiencing quite a lot of environmental but also social changes would be a really sustainable solution. So the traditional boats could be an energy efficient solution for mobility, transport, and the economy of the Aegean Islands. And basically, they would help the communities to adapt to the changing environment and embrace the natural elements around them. Thank you very much for this.
Okay, thank you, Katerina, for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. I don't know if anyone has a question for Katerina that would like to post or to speak. Okay, so everybody is a bit shy today.
Good question.
Yeah, sure.
So it's a little bit beyond your presentation, but I'm just curious, had there been any environmental research to see how the shipbuilding has influenced vegetation? Because if there was a big shipbuilding practice going on, it should have led to a lot of deforestation and I also assume production of tar, for example. Have there been any studies on that?
Well, there haven't been any environmental, I mean, there have been some environmental studies about the forests themselves, and there's been a book that I had in one of my slides that basically looked at the wood cutting practices of Samos for specifically shipbuilding. So they used historians and environmental scientists together to see how that happened. But from what it looks like, the practices actually did not cause much deforestation, because especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, the forests were protected from any other activity. So they wanted the forest of Samos to be vibrant and good because of how important shipbuilding was. So there's some historic documents basically mentioning that the forests of Samos need to be protected. And from what I understood from my interviews, the way they pick the trees is also they are concerned about maintaining the forest. So they pick, of course, the right size and the right shape of a tree, but they also try to clear the forest. So the wood cutting practices involves the maintenance of the forest as well, because if they don't have the trees, they don't have a job. So it didn't, from my understanding from the historical documents and these studies, like the practice did not cause much deforestation. On the contrary, somehow the forest in Samos were better preserved than, for example, some other islands that had deforestation problems.
All right, thank you.
Of course.
Okay, thank you so much. Anybody has another question?
Yeah, I have a difficult question. Is not a question, but about the destruction of the fishing boat. You said that they want to reduce the fishing activity, but they really want to reduce totally the fishing activity, or only that one realized by the little fishing boat, the traditional boat, because it's difficult to think that this little traditional boat can really impact in the fishing in the Mediterranean Sea. So they want to change the kind of boat, make some electric boat or something new with, or they want to reduce the fishing at all.
So this is a choice that Greece is doing. The EU legislation just wants to reduce how many boats are fishing, basically, in the Mediterranean and in Europe in general. But Greece, for some reason, is choosing to give the subsidies to small fishermen, which usually has to do with political reasons and potentially re-election of specific political parties. So it's like a small gift. Please vote for us, kind of thing. But the destruction of the boats is not really helping the environment, and it doesn't reduce overfishing, because normally this would give the subsidies to big trawlers to stop fishing, and there's no need to destruct. So the EU legislation does not require the boats to be destroyed, so they could be abandoned, they could be reused. But again, for some reason, the Greek government has made that choice to destroy those boats, and it's very confusing. And we are trying with some colleagues in Greece to actually put a protection under them so this does not happen anymore, because it's unfair and unreasonable and not really helping with the problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's a political choice that doesn't make sense, and we're trying to see what we can do about it. That's the short answer.
Yeah, in Italy we have the same, because we have to have a perfect number of boats, of fishing boats. So they change the boat, they destruct the ancient one to have the possibility to build a new one. So they make a compensation. You destroy the old one, but you need to have a new one. But it's similar as you, but it's not good to describe.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. I'm sorry, we are a bit out of time, so we're going to continue with the next presentation by Peter Larsson, which is entitled Versatility as a Cultural Niche. So you have the words.
I should unmute myself as well. Okay, and I hope you can see my slide properly. So yes, I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Helsinki, and this short presentation is based on an article I published earlier this year with the same title. It's made within the Academy of Finland project called Survivors of Ragnarök, Tracing Late Iron Age and Early Medieval Maritime Migration in the Baltic Sea region. So I'm not a proper maritime archaeologist, so you will have to deal with some land use talk, but it is a maritime setting after all. So one of my interest area for my research is the Åland Islands, which is located in the southern end of the Botnian Bay in the Baltic Sea. And the case study I'm going to present today is located in what is called the main Åland Island, quite central on that larger island. But this is a group of islands that are reaching over 6,700. But it's a rather limited available land for different land use even today. But if you go back in time, there was a higher sea level, so the land available for land use in this maritime setting was rather limited. So I'm going to present a focus on the Iron Age and specifically on this case study area I have at Lovspelleträsk, and then I'm going to talk about a versatile type of subsistence strategy in this maritime setting. So the Iron Age, or the Åland in general in the past, has been assumed as very marginal. And then a result of that is that there hasn't been a lot of archaeology implemented or pollen studies. So for the Iron Age in total, which is a period of 500 BC until 1050 CE, we only have about 200 radiocarbon dates. So we don't really know that much about this period. And if you look at the archaeological features in the landscape, the early Iron Age is largely missing. We don't have a lot of knowledge about it. But the late Iron Age is much more prominent, where we have settlements and we have cemeteries with visible grave mounds in the landscape. So in this case study area that's highlighted here is a 3-kilometer buffer from the lake that I have sampled for pollen studies. We have a total of about 50 late Iron Age features in the landscape. So in this northeastern region of the lake, we do have a small area of land that are kind of suitable for agrarian activities. We also have some grave mounds visible and some Stone Age foundation buildings, which are typical for the late Iron Age. So we do have some influence of or presence of human activity here. But in this southern region, as you can see here, we have a much more denser population, where we have these larger red dots or cemeteries where we have about 100 to 180 grave mounds. So a relatively dense population in the late Iron Age. And it's quite interesting that there seemed to be an increase in population as we entered the late Iron Age, because this was a period where we had the late Antique Little Ice Age, which we know influenced a lot of settlements in these northern regions. So if you compare, for example, the Mälar Valley in Sweden, we have a lot of settlements that seem to be abandoned. But here we see the opposite. Here we have indication of an increased population instead. So that's basically why we wanted to study this specific site with a pollen core, to see if we can see a similar signal in the pollen, if there is an increased land use, for example, and if that, what type of resources did they use. So the result of the pollen shows that there is a small anthropogenic signal already in the early Iron Age. For example, we have a few occurrences of barley indicating cultivation. We also have some cannabis present here, which might indicate active human cultivation, because we know from Sweden, for example, that cannabis was cultivated mainly to produce ropes. But in general, it's a very little influence of human activities in the pollen signal in the early Iron Age. So it seems like maritime resources still were more important in the subsistence strategy. But then as we enter the late Iron Age, which is about the third zone here in the pollen diagram, we see a rather abrupt change in the pollen signal. The AP levels go down, meaning that the trees decline. Simultaneously, we have an increase in some sun-loving taxa, like juniper, for example, is a very prominent peak in this late Iron Age period. So this indicates that the forest canopy opened up and we got a more open landscape. Combined with this, we also see a slight increase in microscopic charcoal particles, might indicate that they used fire to burn off woods, for example. But we also have an establishment of a much clearer cereal cultivation in the pollen signal, where both barley and rye is being cultivated. So we see that the pollen data that goes hand in hand with the archaeological data, suggests that we do have an increased population with an increased land use to follow that. Then as we go on, there is something happening in the Viking period. There is a decrease in the anthropogenic signal, but it's still some activity going on. Some data suggest we still have some grazing activities in the region, and there are a few occurrences of cereal grains as well. But if you compare to other case studies that have been done south and east of this region on the Åland, they show a small scale, but still a little more clear agrarian activity. So I don't think that this Viking Age event is a crisis, but more of some cultural driven process, likely some sort of demographic relocation. Perhaps they change from a more spread out pattern of settlements until clustering into villages or something like that. But then as we move into the medieval period, the agrarian signal is reestablished and continues into early modern period. And it's quite similar to the Iron Age. We still have barley and rye being cultivated. And in the medieval period, we also have a clearer signal of cannabis that might indicate active cultivation, but still relatively low frequencies of these pollen grains. So in the article, I argue that the Åland Islands was actively sort of colonized. Of course, there were people there already, but more people moved in because there was a possibility to combine a lot of resources within the subsistence strategy. So we do have cereal cultivation, and we do have a versatility within that as well, where both barley and rice being cultivated. But macrofossil analysis from settlements have also shown evidence of oat and wheat being present on the islands. And especially rice, quite interesting, because we have, for example, in Norway, case studies that show that settlements that adapted their cereal cultivation towards rye and barley, which are cereal types that are a bit tougher, they can handle this more colder and humid climate that we got in the late Iron Age. So these settlements that adapted their land use seems to have been able to survive into the Viking Age, while settlements that didn't really adapt their cereal cultivation appears to have been abandoned to a much larger degree. We also have animal husbandry, as I mentioned, some indications, and that is also supported in osteological material, where we show a variety of different domesticated animals. Of course, it is an island, so maritime resources were utilized and were very important in the subsistence strategy. We have different types of seals being present in the osteological material. We had different types of waterfowl and fish and so on. So maritime resources were important. And we also have trade. We have found Oriental silver in graves and in settlement areas, indicating that the population partook in long-distance trading. And the placement of the Åland Islands are very strategic, looking at the commodity exchange in the late Iron Age. A lot of the products taken out from Scandinavia came from the northern Borean forest, where they had iron production and they hunted, and furs and bones and horns and stuff like that were used as commodities. So when they want to take this south and east, Åland would have been a very natural stop along the way in this. So it seems like there were a very versatile subsistence strategy with these four main components. So islands are, of course, in general assumed to be very heavily maritime based in their subsistence strategy, but this showed that also land use were an important aspect of it. And it seems like this was a very active choice, an active sort of risk management, and that seems to have been successful because it is rather continuous into the medieval period and the early modern era. So this versatility is interesting, and it's something new, especially when it comes to islands and coastal settings, I think. So yeah, I mean, that's basically what I have. It's a bit short, I guess, but a bit longer coffee break instead, perhaps, if there isn't a lot of questions.
Yeah, don't worry. So thank you so much for your presentation. And now I open to the public if they have any questions for the moment. Any questions? Okay, so I'll start. So I would like to know how is nowadays the use of this kind of resource has been following line or has been changed this kind of resource?
Yeah, I mean, today I would say it's more potatoes that are being cultivated in Ålands, not so much cereals. There are still cereal cultivation, and animal husbandry are still present, but it's not as important as a sort of subsistence strategy because it's a modern society. They have a lot of imports of foodstuff, so they're not self-sufficient in the same way as there was in the past. And you can see also a change in the vegetation, that the landscape is a bit more forested today. But I also plan in the future, because there will be more case studies from Åland that I'm going to do. So I plan for the future to make a more sort of holistic approach to see how land use have changed in larger picture, also compared to early modern and modern period, and also how that might have influence on biodiversity, for example, and stuff like that. But there, of course, there is quite a big difference in subsistence strategy and land use today compared to the Iron Age.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other question for our conferences?
I have a question. I'm interested to know if, for example, there's a change in the data because you were showing the data before the late Iron Age, Ice Age, and then afterwards, like, did people change substantially what they were doing? Like when the climate started being warmer again, did it change or did it become better connected to the surrounding areas, or do you have any data on this at all?
Do you mean between
The Ålands and or the islands within the Ålands, or in general in the Baltic? Like, do you see anything
Right.
afterwards that is notable? Like,
well, I mean, the smaller islands hasn't really been researched at all. So my case studies and earlier case studies by other people are from the main Åland Islands. We can't really say about the smaller islands. I'm sure there are some archaeological data that has been occurring, but I'm not an archaeologist in that way. I'm mostly working with pollen data. So I can't really say, but when it comes to the main Åland, there isn't a big change really, because I guess it was some sort of, if I think freely, like they know that this is working even in periods of crisis. And of course, it is sort of a challenge to do these sort of activities because it is a very limited land. And the further back in time you go, the land was even more limited due to the changes in sea level. So I believe that there were knowledge that this has worked for us previously, so we perhaps should continue with a similar type of land use. Then there might be certain local changes, but what I have so far seems to be fairly similar from the late Iron Age and onwards, except this Viking Age occurrence that I mentioned that currently I don't really know. I'm going to look closer into that in the future. So there is something happening there, but in general, it seems to be quite continuous when it comes to the main Åland Island, at least.
yeah, that's very interesting. Like, they were autonomous and they knew what they were doing, and it's like really, it shows like this sort of island resilience very clearly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have a space for another question. I think everybody's a bit shy today.
It's also a bit different type of data, what most people here might be used to, I assume.
It's very good though. Maybe if there's no other questions, we can go on the break. Victoria, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the same. So
Yeah.
we will meet in a couple minutes.
Yeah, so I think the next session starts, let me see, at 11:05. So we have basically a 20-minute break for coffee, eating something, or whatever you need.
Yeah. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah.